So according to this view, I'll repeat, perpetrators' actions below the highest rank result in a large part from conforming to the group's sense of morality and purpose rather than from psychopathology. So this is what you find in Ordinary Men, in Browning's book, in the German Reserve Police Battalion. Welcome back to MindMatters, everyone. Just me in the studio today, Harrison Cayley. Today, I'm going to be going over what I think is one of the most interesting and probably, well, to me at least, most important psychopathy papers in many years. This one was just published in the Journal of Criminal Justice. I'll have a link to the article below where you can find it. It is called Psychopathy and Crimes Against Humanity, a Conceptual and Empirical Examination of Human Rights Violators. It's by Robert D. Hare, Elizabeth Leon Meyer, Joanna Rasuant Salinas, Jorge Folino, and Craig S. Newman. Apologies if I got any of those names wrong or pronounced incorrectly. I'm going to be reading parts of it and discussing as well, so I'll start out by just reading the abstract. The purpose of the study says, there is a dearth of empirical data on the contributions of personality, psychopathology, and psychopathy to terrorism and its actors. Because of a fortuitous set of circumstances, we had access to a sample of men convicted of crimes against humanity, CAH, committed during the Pinochet regime, each rated by expert clinicians on the Psychopathy Checklist Revised. We also had PCL-R ratings for samples of general offenders and community participants. Methods. We determined the psychometric properties of the PCL-R for these samples, performed structural equation modeling to investigate the factor structure of the PCL-R, and conducted a latent profile analysis of the obtained factors to identify classes or subtypes within the samples. Results. The PCL-R's psychometric properties and factor structure were in accord with findings from other countries and settings. The PCR total scores of the CAH and general offenders were virtually the same, but much higher than those of the community sample. However, the CAH group had extraordinarily high scores on the interpersonal affective facets, yet relatively low scores on the lifestyle antisocial facets. LPA identified the expected 4 latent classes, with most CHA men located within the callous conning class. Conclusions. The results of this study provide unique information about the psychopathic propensities of a sample of state violators of human rights. Their pattern of PCL-R scores was consistent with an extreme disposition for self-serving, callous, and ruthless treatment of others, without guilt or remorse, and in the absence of a prior documented history of severe antisocial behavior. So as they write in the introduction, to our knowledge, this is the first study to use a validated clinical forensic measure of psychopathy among army and police officers convicted of a particular form of state terrorism, crimes against humanity. The scale was the PCL-R. The men had played an active role in the atrocities committed during the Pinochet regime in Chile. Psychological research of this sort is rare in any jurisdiction, particularly in Latin American states still dealing with the aftermath of military dictatorships. Military dictators in these states had concealed their crimes, as detailed by the National Commission on the Disappeared, the National Commission on Truth and Reconciliation, and the National Commission on Political Imprisonment and Torture. Subsequent democratic governments in Chile have not provided a reliable register of murders committed by state agents. So they go on to give a little bit of a history of how this study came about, and pointing out that it is the first study of its sort, or at least that they're aware of, because it's hard to get access to these types of criminals. Probably the last time anything similar was done was at the Nuremberg trials with the Nazi war criminals that were on trial there, and they were examined and interviewed by numerous psychologists and psychiatrists. But that was in the late 40s, and that was before, of course, any kind of modern psychometric test was available, like the PCL-R. And if you read the work of like Gustav Gilbert, for instance, he talked about his interviews and studies of guys like Hermann Göring, and how he identified Göring as a manipulative psychopath, but not really that applicable to the current state of how these things are researched. But how they were able to do this was that these Chilean researchers basically were able to get access to this prison where devoted exclusively to housing these and imprisoning these convicted, not necessarily war criminals, but criminal people guilty of crimes against humanity in Chile. So there's one prison that houses a bunch of these people that were found guilty over various years for crimes committed during the Pinochet era in the 70s and 80s. And so Rasuant Salinas was a senior member of the prison facility. And so they basically got access to these guys and were able to arrange in-depth interviews with them and studies of their case files, and therefore able to do a full PCL-R test on each of these guys, and came to some interesting conclusions. I'll read, before we get to those, however, I want to read just a little bit of this background information. So this is from 1.3, Crimes Against Humanity, Chile. The depictions of terrorism mentioned above are compatible with the voluminous accounts of the Pinochet regime and its use of state agencies such as the military, police, and security services for a reign of terror against segments of the Chilean population. The International Commission of Jurists noted, Pinochet was a dictator who would stop at nothing to consolidate his power. His regime eliminated thousands of opponents. During the dictatorship, arbitrary executions, arrests, assassinations, torture, and disappearances were standard practices. Tens of thousands of Chileans met their fate at the hands of Pinochet's ruthless regime. The acts attributed to Mr. Pinochet constitute crimes against humanity and grave infractions of international humanitarian law. The background and dynamics of the Pinochet regime are complicated, fraught with long-standing geopolitical, economic, religious, and international intrigue, and all well beyond the scope of this article. However, several general themes provide a backdrop for the actions of those convicted of crimes against humanity. Throughout much of the 20th century, Chile experienced chronic inequities and struggles among the working class, large landowners, financial and bureaucratic oligarchs and bourgeoisie, and multinational companies. The Cold War, the rise of socialism, fear of communism, economic problems, nationalization of industries, and American intervention in Chilean affairs colored political and military attitudes and behaviors. The nature and role of the military, and to an extent the police and security forces, are essential here. For example, the military in Latin America traditionally has been professional, career-oriented, modeled after civilian institutions, concerned with external threats and warfare, and separate from the country's politics. Students, primarily from the middle class, entered the military academy in their mid to late teens and progressed through a military analog of university studies. By the 1960s, in the wake of revolutionary insurgencies in other countries, military personnel began to study at the United States Escuela de las Americas, the School of the Americas, in the Panama Canal Zone, where they learned interrogation, warfare, and counterinsurgency techniques. The military's role became political, managerial, concerned with internal challenges to national security, skilled in dealing with suspected subversives, and repressive. In 1970, Salvador Allende Gossens, a medical doctor from an upper-middle-class background, became president of Chile. His attempts to restructure Chile as a socialist democracy led to some reforms, political, economic, and civil unrest, and conflicts with the interests of other countries, particularly the United States. The military coup and death of Allende in 1973 saw the establishment of the National Intelligence Directorate, the DINA, referred to as Pinochet's secret police, or Gestapo. The DINA, I'll just call it the DINA, and various military intelligence, security, and police forces, including the militarized federal police, targeted and violently suppressed opposition by political leaders, students, trade union activists, workers, journalists, and social militants. Because of pressure from the United States in 1977, the military dictatorship replaced the DINA with the Central Nacional de Informaciones, the CNI, which carried on business as usual. Operation Condor facilitated these individual state operations, a transnational system of state terror that allowed one country to track down its citizens in another Latin American country and kidnap, torture, kill, or disappear them. Condor effectively integrated and expanded the state terror unleashed across South America during the Cold War after successive right-wing military coups. Often encouraged by the U.S., erased democracy across the continent. I screwed up some of my emphases there. Tremlett described Operation Condor consisted of Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Bolivia, Paraguay, Brazil, Peru, and Ecuador. They formed a single network that covered 4/5 of the continent. The men perpetrating such crimes saw themselves as warriors in a messianic, frontierless war against the spread of armed revolution across Latin America. Bringing them to justice has been slow, piecemeal, and often hampered by opposition from the countries involved in the crimes. The relevance of the above outline is that the participants in the current study were members of the DINA, CNI, or related military and police organizations, referred to as the armed forces. They participated in an unstable political and socio-economic environment that fostered and rewarded both the bright and shadow aspects of leadership. The former includes physical courage, risk-taking, adaptability, self-reliance, and support of subordinates. The latter involves unethical and unlawful behaviors of leaders and followers, influenced or facilitated by being in a dangerous, chaotic, or violent environment. As noted by Fisher et al., the lack of taboos and prohibitive rules found in war may allow leaders to rationalize behaviors that would be unacceptable in a different context. Before and during the Pinochet years, the socioeconomic and political conditions provided a fertile environment for ambitious men with bright and shadow leadership qualities who shared the regime's view that communism was a threat to the country. We might argue that such a milieu would be particularly favorable for those most willing and able to exploit the opportunities afforded by darkness and chaos, with little concern for the morality of their actions. Babiak and Hare suggested, psychopaths are emotionally unaffected by the human physical and psychological carnage that accompanies chaotic disasters. They are, by nature, predisposed to take callous but pragmatic advantage of the turmoil and terror experienced by others. Why, then, is there such a dearth of research on psychopathy and terrorism? So this last sentence is a reference to their look at the terrorism research. And apparently they've got a whole write-up that they didn't include in this paper on the background and the specific, specifically looking at the link between psychopathy and terrorism and any research done there. And they point out it's a big field, full of kind of contradictory approaches. It's not very rigorous in its in this multitude of approaches and takes. And they give a little bit of the background, actually, that at first, several researchers had suggested a link between terrorism and psychopathy, suggesting that this might be an important thing to look at. And then, but that has pretty much totally changed, where there are no studies looking at the link between psychopathy and terrorism, and the ones that do look at psychopathology in this context kind of downplay it. They take the kind of like a sociological approach that looking at the economic and social and interpersonal factors that go into or that contribute to an individual kind of associating with a terroristic group, and that a lot of these researchers explicitly reject the link between any kind of psychopathology and terrorism, often coming to conclusions like saying that there's no higher levels of identifiable psychopathology within their samples of terrorists that they were able to test in some way. And so Hare and the rest in this article point out the problems with that conclusion. It's not as cut and dried as a lot of these terrorism researchers make it seem to be. For one, there's only I think one or two actual studies that actually look at psychopathy using an actual psychopathy test, not just some just the how do they put it? Not just anecdotal, speculative, or unvalidated measures for psychopathy. So it is, and there are a few researchers now that are stressing that this is probably important to look at, and so hopefully that'll change, because, as they point out, this is the first article of its kind, specifically in relation to crimes against humanity, and I found it to be. One of the reasons I was excited when I found this paper is that if you read Robert Hare's book, of course, Robert Hare was a developer of the PCL-R. The test that is mentioned in the article is the one that they used to test these prisoners. He's also the author of Without Conscience and, with Paul Babiak, Snakes in Suits. So the first book, Without Conscience, of Hare's focuses on mostly psychopaths in a prison situation, so kind of the criminal psychopath. Snakes in Suits, with Paul Babiak, gets into corporate psychopathy. So the idea that there are that psychopaths aren't just common criminals or drug dealers or serial killers or anything like that, but you can have a psychopathic personality in a corporate environment, and they write about what that looks like and what the results of someone in that kind of position look like. So this is the first time that Hare and Babiak are kind of explicitly moving into a more political environment and looking at the possible influence of psychopathy in this case in dictatorships. So that's why it stood out, as important to me. As our viewers and listeners will know, I recently edited the new edition of Political Polarization by Andrew Lobachevsky, who talks about just these things. Lobachevsky observes that the secret police guys, the concentration guards in Nazi Germany, were often psychopaths, almost as a rule, and it makes sense. He also talks about this, what he calls the Polarization Process, where in a country, during a chaotic time like this, it creates the conditions for psychopaths to kind of move up the political ladder. The conditions are right for them to kind of take more of a leadership role, gain more influence, and eventually take power completely. And so and very few academics have gone in this direction or cited Lobachevsky's work as of yet. So maybe this will change. Now, as a bit of background, before we get into the actual studies and the results that they found, I want to bring up one more thing. This was new to me just because, it was several years since I'd looked at the psychopathy research. I mean, I read Thompson's book, Understanding Psychopathy, which pretty much sums everything up, sums up most of the research as of a couple, 2 or 3 years ago. But there was something in here that was mentioned briefly in the abstract that I want to get to. And this is the idea of classes, subtypes, varieties. This has been in the last, I think, 7 to, 2 to 7 years, in the last 7 years, doing more analysis on kind of large pools of data on psychopathy scores. Researchers like Hare and others have found 4 identifiable subtypes. They are classed as and named the prototypic, conning callous, externalizing, and general. Now, to understand what these are, we'll have to get into a bit about the PCL-R and what it measures. So we'll bring up the picture of one of the figures, figures 1 and 2. So look at figure 1. These are how the different traits, the different items in the PCL-R score, like how they all correlate to each other. So when they do factor analysis, they basically try to look at if there are clusters of these items that correlate together more than they correlate with the other ones. So doing this, they're able to find like 2 factors. There's interpersonal affective and lifestyle antisocial. And then, so the interpersonal correlates with affective, and lifestyle correlates with antisocial, and then they all kind of correlate to a lesser degree. So it kind of breaks down these 20 items into two main groups, and those two main groups kind of break down into two more groups. So interpersonal is things like charming, grandiose, lying, manipulative. Affective, no remorse, shallow, callous, fail to accept responsibility. Lifestyle, the need for stimulation, parasitic lifestyle, lack of goals, or realistic goals, impulsiveness, irresponsibility, and then antisocial behaviors, poor behavioral controls, early behavioral problems, juvenile delinquency, revocation of release if they've been incarcerated or convicted, and criminal versatility. So the different classes show up as different, for instance, the prototypic has a high score on each facet. So this would be your prototypic psychopath who has like you can get a score of like 40 out of 40. There's a great documentary, I think it was done by, it might have been CBC like 20 years ago. And there's there's an interview, probably 10 minutes worth in the documentary with this guy who scores 40 out of 40. I'll try to find the link, and it's on YouTube, so I'll find the link and include it in the show description. But so this guy, 40 out of 40, that would be a prototypical psychopath. And so you get to see interviews with him and get an idea of how he comes across. The second group is the conning, callous one. These have elevations on the interpersonal and affective facets, but not so much on the lifestyle lifestyle antisocial. And so this might be, I'm pretty sure, the kind of, I'm pretty sure that the corporate psychopaths that Paul and Babiak talk about in Snakes and Suits would fall into this group. They're not, they don't necessarily have a history of, gross antisocial behaviors. They're not criminally versatile. They don't have a long arrest and conviction record. They're just primarily conning and callous. And then there's externalizing, also referred to as sociopathic, with a high score on lifestyle and antisocial facets, but not so much a high score on the interpersonal affective ones. So these are people that are, engaged in crime, might be criminally versatile, but they don't have that kind of cold-bloodedness. If they're violent, their violence might be reactive as opposed to instrumental. That is, they get emotional and they act out that emotion on other people, whereas kind of prototypical psychopaths are more cold-blooded and calculating, and they use violence instrumentally to get what they want. So it's not so much that they're emotionally, they're not hot-headed. They use violence as a means to get what they want. And then there's the general, and these have relatively low scores on each facet. So that'll be a background, because they did find in their study, they did find all of these classes replicated in here. So I'll move on to, let's see. Well, some of the obstacles they had to the study, they couldn't get kind of a perfect control sample of people. So they couldn't get, military armed forces members from the same time period who weren't convicted of crimes against humanity. So this really is just a study of those who were convicted. So it's hard, or it's not necessarily accurate or responsible to extrapolate these results on every armed forces member from that time period. What they were able to do was to get to a contemporary prison and community sample to compare with, which isn't perfect, but it shows, you find some interesting results. So I'll move on to the actual study itself. So this is a description of the crimes against humanity, the CAH sample. So in 1995, the Chilean government constructed a prison specifically for men convicted of crimes of human rights violations committed during the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile. These men had been instrumental in directing and carrying out the suppressive policies of the regime. By 2016, the number of inmates in the facility had reached 120. So they were able to study 101 of these, 84%. And as far as we can determine from extensive file information, none of the men had a diagnosable mental or cognitive disorder while serving under the regime or in prison. Documented or reported substance abuse was rare. 63.4 abstained from alcohol, 12.9 had an alcohol problem, and 1% had a drug problem. Most, 72.2%, were married, 2% had lived common law, 11.9% were divorced or separated, and 8.9% were widowers. All but one had been members of the armed forces, 67% in the military, 33% in the police forces. 65% were commissioned officers, many of high rank. There were 12 generals, 8 brigadier generals, 24 colonels, 7 lieutenant colonels, 8 majors, 3 captains, and 3 lieutenants. The rest were non-commissioned warrant officers. So the group was well educated. And we note that these institutions did not accept students with evidence of prior unlawful behavior. However, those whose profile fitted the job requirements became candidates for recruitment by military, police, or intelligence units. During the regime, the officers involved in repression had joined the armed forces well before the coup d'etat. They had reputations for ruthlessness in carrying out their official duties and controlling subordinates. All were graduates of the School of the Americas, where they developed techniques and skills for the interrogation, torture, and murder of suspected communists, educators, union organizers, religious workers, student leaders, the poor, and peasants who fight for their rights. 44 of the men had a conviction for murder, 49 for kidnapping, 4 for criminal conspiracy, and 4 for torture and illegal constraint. Only 5 military men were still in the armed forces at trial. The rest were retired or working in various civilian positions such as security or administration. So right there, one of the first interesting things that stands out is, well, first of all, the fact that they were already in the military by the time of the coup d'etat. So whatever had, if there were any special selection processes that allowed individuals of this type to get in, they were already there. Or, well, there are other possible conclusions to be drawn from that. Maybe we'll get to them. And also that they were actually screened for prior, antisocial behaviors. Now, this is something that I wondered about too, that had come up come up while researching political ponerology. So how exactly does this work? So here's the hypothesis that psychopaths play an essential role in totalitarian systems of government. So, but when we look back at the communist countries, a lot of them, it seems like they weeded out like criminal types. There were still distinctions between criminals and non-criminals. So what's going on here? Well, this paper explains that kind of dynamic that we'll see what the results are. But basically, they screened out overtly criminal types. But that leaves the possibility of this kind of conning callous class to still have a great amount of influence and power within a political system. But we'll get back to that. The second sample was the offender sample. So basically, they had just a group of inmates and various ages. So to compare with the other group, this sample generally was not well educated. Only about 30% had attended a secondary school or technical institute. 38.8% were single. Only 17.7% were married. 35.9% were living common law. 1.9% were widowers, and 5.7% were divorced or separated. Substance abuse, in contrast to the CAH sample, was widespread, with 56.5% and 76.1% having an alcohol or drug problem, and most were unskilled workers. For the community sample, they basically got a bunch of psychology students, if I remember correctly, to volunteer to enlist, they got the psychology students to enlist 3 volunteers, friends, neighbors, handymen, colleagues, etc., to do an interview and to do a PCL-R test to see what their psychopathy score was. So Each participant was over 50 years old, no indications of mental disorders or cognitive problems. And they got as much information as possible to get a community sample, representative sample of the community, to try their best to do so, and compared those. So in this group, alcohol abuse was kind of in between the criminal and the CAH group. Slightly higher than the crimes against humanity group, 14.9%. However, 28.7% abused drugs, a lot more than the CAH group. Again, a lot less than the criminal group. Mostly of the soft variety. Generally relatively well educated, et cetera, et cetera. Teachers, businessmen, technical trades, blue-collar workers, that sort of person. So then they use the PCL-R test and a self-report version, a self-report test, the SRP-SF. Some interesting findings from that too, which we'll get to. Then they did, they go over all of the types of analysis they did, and we'll get to some of the results. So on the PCL-R, they found that the PCL-R total scores for all three groups were very close to those of comparable offender and community groups from North America and other countries. So these results were consistent with, what they already knew about the distribution of psychopathy scores. Even though the mean total scores of the crimes against humanity and offender groups were almost identical, only 7% of the crimes against humanity participants had an elevated PCL-R score greater than 27. The score goes up to 40. Usually 30 is a cutoff point for being considered a psychopath. Compared with 21% of the offender group. So there were 3 times as many in the offender group that had an elevated PCL-R score. And 0% of the community group had a high score. And they point out that this relatively low percentage of the CAH men with very high, let me just read that. The relatively low percentage of CAH men with very high PCL-R scores reflects a low dispersion, standard deviation, of scores and low factor 2 scores. We'll see this in the table, in table 1. So the CAH and offender groups differed considerably in the pattern of their PCL-R facet scores. As figure 3 illustrates, the CAH inmates had much higher mean item scores on factor 1, interpersonal affective facets, but much lower mean item scores on factor 2, lifestyle antisocial facets, than did the offenders. For illustrative purposes, the crimes against humanity total score would fall at about the 46th percentile for the North American reference sample of male offenders. So they're below average compared to North American offenders, as listed in the PCL-R manual. By contrast, the mean factor 1 score, that is the interpersonal affective facets, would fall at about the 92nd percentile. So their factor 1 score was in the top 10% of the North American offender community sample. Further, 10% of the crimes against humanity's inmates, but only 0.5% of the offenders, received the maximum raw score of 16 on factor 1, a value that places them at the 100th percentile of the North American reference sample. The mean CAH factor 2 item score would fall at about the 25th percentile of the reference sample. So these people were, below average overall, much, in the bottom quarter when it comes to antisociality and criminality, but in the top 10 and like even at the very top 100th percentile, as high as you can get on these factor 1 scores. So they had the prototypical, or the callous, how to put this? Some people think that factor 1, Hare and his colleagues don't agree with this, but some people consider the factor 1 score to be like the psychopathic personality. That's the primary psychopathic traits. So on those traits, on factor 1, they had the highest scores, extremely high scores. So here they write, we emphasize that it is unusual for offenders to have factor 1 scores as high as those observed in our CAH sample. Moreover, it is rare to have so many with the highest possible score on factor 1 components, accompanied by very low factor 2 scores. There are several possible explanations for this finding, including age-related reductions in the severity of factor 2 items and underestimation of scores on the antisocial facet. Because basically there's documented research showing that antisocial behaviors kind of decline over time. The factor 1 traits remain relatively constant, whereas the actual criminal behaviors can decline over time. So they're analyzing these guys when they're they're old, and they've they haven't had, or their criminal. It's possible that their criminality has declined with age, but also it's also possible that there's an underestimation of the scores on the antisocial facet because, well, lack of data. I think they basically say. So, what would they say here? Okay, it is possible, for example, that the item poor behavioral controls often was scored 0 for these guys because its defining behaviors were within the accepted norm. It is also likely that low antisocial facet scores reflected the geopolitical, socioeconomic context during the Pinochet regime and policies and practice for selecting and managing military and police personnel. As discussed in the introduction, military and police training in Chile, as in the other Latin American countries of Operation Condor, tended to exclude applicants with evidence of overt antisocial and delinquent behaviors. At the same time, the Pinochet regime fostered, and no doubt promoted, those who most readily could adapt to a new culture of chaos and violence, notably if it advanced the suppression of socialism and the nation's protection as patriotic duties. In essence, before and during the Pinochet era, Chile's political and economic atmosphere was ideal for the emergence of a brutal, despotic regime populated by ambitious, unscrupulous, and opportunistic individuals who seamlessly adopted a role as defenders of the state. Section 4.5 illustrates that those who rose to the top were the most psychopathic of all. Very interesting. So I'll now show, let's show figure 3. So this shows the classes that they identified. Or no, these are the different scores for the 3 different groups. So you can see the the community sample on the bottom, which has a relatively low score on all facets of the PCL-R, all psychopathy facets. Then you've got the offenders that are relatively high on all. And then you've got the crimes against humanity, who are way higher, or, significantly higher in factor 1, interpersonal and affective. So they've got higher scores than the offenders on those, but lower scores than the offenders on antisociality and lifestyle facets. Now, this one, figure 4, shows is this what I'm looking for? No, we'll skip figure 4. That's the self-report. I'll just mention that briefly later on. I'll mention it now. So what they found on the self-report is that the crimes against humanity group was much closer to the community sample in their scores. So their self-reported, psychopathic traits, interpersonal and affective psychopathic traits, they self-reported those traits as being much lower than what the testers rated them as. So that they rated themselves, it makes sense. They rated themselves as being more normal than they actually were. But interestingly enough, they actually admitted to to a higher level of antisociality. And I'll read the author's interpretation of these results. That is, the reported self-perceptions of the CAH men diverged considerably from expert clinical assessments, perhaps because of a lack of insight or, more likely, positive impression management. Gillard and Rogers found that offenders with high Factor 1 scores were particularly successful at manipulating risk assessment scores and at concealing or minimizing antisocial and criminal activities. However, the mean self-report total and antisocial facet scores were higher among the CAH sample than among the community sample, with large effect sizes. This suggests that the CAH cases were aware of some of their antisocial propensities, perhaps viewing and reporting them as personal strengths or as not damaging to their public image. So the next interesting thing they found was that when they analyzed the data in terms of the rank of the individual involved, they found a linear relationship between rank and psychopathy score. In other words, lower the rank, lower the psychopathy score. Higher the rank, higher the psychopathy score. Highest rank has the highest psychopathy scores. So the mean total PCL-R score for the junior, middle, and senior ranks was respectively 19.1, 21.4, and 23.7. Again, those are out of 40. And the main source of difference among military ranks was the interpersonal factor, facet, followed by the affective facet. In each case, the association was linear, with the senior ranks having the highest score and junior ranks having the lowest score. Each rank had scores considerably higher than those of the offenders. Okay. So, I'll read one more little section, and then we'll get to the discussion section of the paper. So this is on the latent profile analysis. So this is on the subtypes, the classes that I mentioned, the prototypical, the conning, callous, the externalizing, and the general or the common, whatever the last one is. So they found that, let's see. We'll bring up figure 6. Where is that? So figure 6, this shows the classes identified in the CAH sample. So you see we've got, or is that? Let me just make sure that's what that is. Figure 6. So when they analyzed the the subclasses, the subtypes, prototypic, callous, conning, externalizing, and general, they basically found the same division. So what they write in this section is, specifically, there was within sample variation in the relative contribution of the psychopathy facets, with 7% of the members in the prototypic class, 14% in the externalizing one, and 1% in the general. That is, 15% of the sample of those convicted of crimes against humanity did not have Factor 1 ratings indicative of a deceptive, manipulative, and callous psychopathic personality. So that is the externalizing and general classes. So 15% of these people did not have high psychopathic traits. These are people you might just consider, ordinary men, ordinary people, or sociopaths. Sociopaths, not psychopaths. So that's a whole other discussion. But yet, they write, they had committed heinous crimes. These individuals came from the lower ranks, and we might speculate that their actions were less a result of psychopathic propensities than of extant cultural and organizational factors that promoted violent and criminal behaviors, as in sociopathy or secondary psychopathy. Relatedly, Cementi, Capri, La Barbera, and Caretti found that low or mid members of the mafia convicted for a variety of violent crimes, had lower PCL-R total and Factor 1 scores than did other male offenders with similar convictions. The authors commented that the members had internalized mafia ideals and principles, had strong family ties, and had committed criminal acts more out of loyalty to the organization and their family than out of personal interest. Chimenti et al. Also noted that Italian law prevented them from interviewing higher levels bosses of mafia organizations, among whom psychopathic traits might be more severe. We did not have the same problem. So that's an interesting paper too. Doing the study on these people, these mafia convicts, and finding that they actually had relatively low psychopathy scores, even if they'd been arrested for, if I remember correctly, crimes that could even be like murders, assassinations, things like that. But the possibility is that you find the real psychopaths at the higher levels. So there's a few, look at the time here, there's a few interesting things in the general discussion at the end of the paper. Let's see. So a common feature of these actors. Okay, so a common feature of these CAH group was a declared lack of remorse or moral responsibility for actions that purged the state of political deviance. As Diggleman put it, there is a substantive gap between the assumed and the actual role of apology and remorse in international criminal proceedings. Cases of sincere remorse or apologies among high ranks are hardly existent, and fakery of remorse is fostered by judicial practice. Importantly, for our purposes, Diggleman distinguished between perpetrators with the highest ranks and those with only a high rank. The former, the highest ranks, are conflict entrepreneurs who use neutralization techniques to create a group value system and identity to normalize criminal and violent enterprises. They formulate and spread the ideology and demand allegiance from the rest, and their actions and lack of remorse are related to psychopathologies such as malignant narcissism or psychopathy. According to this view, perpetrators' actions below the highest rank result in large part from conforming to the group's sense of morality and purpose rather than from psychopathology. So this relates to a point that I made in the introduction to political ponerology, looking at three famous or semi-famous studies: the Milgram experiment, the Zimbardo prison experiment, and Christopher Browning's book Ordinary Men, on the German Reserve Police Battalion that was involved in, also crimes against humanity, torture, murder, mass murder. And one of the points I made in there is that if you look at the studies like Milgram and the Zimbardo at the prison experiment, Stanford prison experiment, it seems like the assumption of a lot of people, well, the experimenters themselves and a lot of people who cite these studies, is, well, they're focused on, well, how can ordinary people do these sorts of things? And what are, in the Milgram experiment, what are the limits of conformity, of obedience to authority? And they found some very interesting conclusions. And all three sources found something very similar that I point out. That is that in all three situations, you find a small group, a small minority, who are totally willing and able to do whatever their orders are, no matter how how deviant. So you'll find a small sadistic group. You'll find a majority within the group, a large majority, who are reluctant but who go along with the crowd. They don't want to push the buzzer to punish the person in the Milgram experiment. They don't want to be engaged in abuse of other test subjects in a prison environment. They don't want to shoot a family of civilians in a war zone in a cleanup operation. but they do it because they're ordered to and because everyone else is doing it. And then you always also find a small group of refusers. So there's always a small group of people that will refuse to go along with it. And what's refreshing is to see that there are some people that get it, that, it's not just a study of normal people. First of all, the test subjects in Milgram and Zimbardo, but to a lesser degree because there are some potential problems with his methodology. But if you look at just Milgram, or in a real life scenario like the German Reserve Police Battalion, you have a whole bunch of ordinary people, and then you put them in a new situation, and they essentially sort themselves out into different groups, the three that I mentioned, roughly. But there's no focus on, well, what must be the personality of the person giving the orders, the person defining these policies and these practices in the first place. So in the Milgram experiment, what role was Milgram playing? Because in ordinary life, you obviously don't have researchers like Milgram himself telling people to give other people electric shocks. The very fact that he had to pretend that role or get someone else to pretend to be in that role shows how out of the ordinary it is, how unnormal it is, abnormal it is. So, but it's very hard to turn those tables and to study that position, those types of people scientifically. And because that's hard, there's been this dearth of research that Hare and the other authors talk about. But like I said, luckily there are a few people that at least speculate. It seems it should be obvious. It seems like common sense, but it's nice to have the details and to see it studied in depth. So like they have in this quote about the highest rank, that there are conflict entrepreneurs. So these are people who use techniques to create this new value system. And as they write, as Hare writes, these actions are going to show the signs of psychopathy. And so according to this view, I'll repeat, perpetrators' actions below the highest rank result in a large part from conforming to the group's sense of morality and purpose rather than from psychopathology. So this is what you find in Ordinary Men, in Browning's book, in the German Reserve Police Battalion. You find that all of these guys are conforming, and they conform so much that they get used to it, more or less. I mean, it's still disturbing, but they do it, and they get used to it. So they go on to talk about these subtypes. They pretty much reiterate this division that they found, this callous conning. They talk about the idea that factor 1 is more of a primary psychopathy and factor 2 is secondary psychopathy, point out some of the problems with seeing it that way. And let's see, is there anything else? Well, one more comment that they write on the difference between the expert assessment using the PCL-R and the self-report using the SRP-SF. They write, whatever the explanation, it is clear that these two instruments did not provide congruent representations of the psychopathy construct among men convicted of crimes against humanity. Had we used only the self-report, we would have concluded that these actors were much less psychopathic than were general offenders, and no more psychopathic than were community men. More generally, these results suggest that investigators should be circumspect when comparing research findings based solely on self-report measures of psychopathy with those based on the PCL-R, especially when dealing with a population likely to harbor individuals with very high factor 1 scores. Beyond this, the SRP-SF may have provided clinical information about how highly psychopathic individuals deal with questions about their nature. Yeah, well, they try to hide it. So that's pretty much the paper. I'll include a link to it. so you can read it on your own, because there's more details than I was able to read. I just focused on the bits that stood out as most interesting to me. But one of the questions that I'm left with is this group. So, well, it'll be interesting I hope there are more studies like this done, because I want to know if the extremely high factor 1 score and very low factor 2 score is actually evidence of kind of an extreme version of the callous conning class, psychopathic subtype, or if it is, as they suggest, maybe that's just a result of lack of information about other antisocial behaviors, criminality, or if it is a result of combined with the age effect. Is this class like a new subtype, or a variation on this subtype? Because, as I mentioned earlier, one of those interesting things was that the military, the armed forces, actually screened out criminal individuals. So there was this sifting process, this screening process, where you got rid of a certain type or certain types of psychopaths. Not only did you filter out the externalizing, like, sociopathic group. These are the individuals like antisocial personality disorder, sociopathy, who are very criminal, have a history of criminality, but relatively low factor 1 scores. So you filter out that kind of criminal element, which is like, I can't remember the percentage, but a very high percentage of the people currently in prison. And then, but you also filter out the kind of like full-blown prototypic psychopaths who have both, high scores on both. So, and then you're left with this callous conning group who are able to be, they're able to function in a society to a greater degree than the criminal types, than the sociopaths or the extreme psychopaths. So I would like to see more research, on this type. Is it a type that's in the general population? Now, one other thing that stood out is the study, the test that they did on their community sample. So they find a random group of people and extremely low psychopathy scores, and that's the case. That's the case in just the majority of the general population. I haven't checked out the papers yet, but so I'm wondering if I can find a graph of this. But if you lay out a bar graph or a bar chart for the total psychopathy scores for, like, what is it? Something like 80% of people, it'll be really, really low. And then for maybe 15% of people, 15 to 20%, it'll be mid-range. And then you've got this, this small group of people who have a tiny percentage of people who have a very high score, 40 out of 40. So it looks kind of like this. And so when you just have a general sample of the community, you're not going to find very many prototypical psychopaths. The estimate is around 1%. But it would be interesting to see the breakdown of data if it was somehow possible to do PCL-R scores on like a sample of like 10,000 people in the general population, like from all walks of life, every area, and then to see how those subtypes break down. Like, are you able to find, a group of individuals with extremely high factor 1 scores, but, very low factor 2 scores? Because these people wouldn't be in prison necessarily if they're not criminal. They might get caught for something, but they won't be, they won't have that criminal versatility that that prototypical psychopaths have. So that's one thing too that I'm going to be looking out for, that I hope more people will do research on. But maybe my last point is to bring up one more thing from Polarization. And he points out that he wrote this book before the psychopathy checklist, before Robert Hare. He did have access to Hervé Cleckley's book, The Mask of Sanity, the kind of classic that inspired Hare in his work on psychopathy. And one of the things that Lobachevsky points out is that in a pathocracy, it's his word for a totalitarian government, the nature of which is shaped by the influence and presence of psychopaths. In a pathocracy, the types that play the most important roles are what Cleckley called the incomplete manifestations, and what modern psychologists might call the subclinical types. So I'm wondering, I think, my guess is that these types identified in the Hare paper among these armed forces personnel are essentially what Lobachevsky and Cleckley were talking about. Primarily what Lobachevsky is talking about. What am I talking about? Well, that the individuals that Lobachevsky is talking about are these high factor 1 types with low factor 2. They, unless you know their kind of criminal history, they might just be they might just have the reputation as being a ruthless general, but nevertheless, depending on the time you're living in, the place you're living in, that can be a very prestigious position, causing people to think, oh, well, there's nothing, what's the problem? They've got a steady job. They're good at their job. They're obviously not this parasitic criminal type that has no responsibility. These are people that do their jobs and do them well. So in that sense, they kind of manage to, exist like a wolf in sheep's clothing among the allegedly non-criminal population. So my last point I wanted to make in relation to ponerology. So we'll notice that that this was in the context of an anti-communist, right-wing dictatorship. So this is a point that I think Lobachevsky makes. I've got a footnote in there. Let me see if I can find this footnote. Yeah, 321. So Lobachevsky's talking about the situation in the Cold War, where you've got communism in the USSR and various other countries, which he considers a pathocracy. So he's saying that the same thing is going on in the communist countries. And then in the West, you have this reaction to and fear of communism. And so he writes about the Pathocratic ideology. So in this case, using communism as an example. So along with its degenerate growth, such an ideology is rejected by all those social groups governed by healthy common sense. The activities of such an ideology thus induce nations to stick to their old tried-and-true basics in terms of structural forms, providing hardline conservatives with the best weapon possible. So basically, there will be a hardline conservative reaction to a pathocratic ideology like communism in the 20th century. So I've got a comment on that, though, a footnote. I note that they can also lead to a right-wing reaction, sometimes approaching the same degree of pathology. For example, the anti-communist regimes of Hitler, Franco, and Pinochet. So the sad irony is that the West, in its reaction to communism, misdiagnosed the problem, and then support all of these right-wing dictatorships in Latin America as a bulwark against the imposition of communism, and in the process, they essentially create the same thing, pathocracy. This is This was a repeating process, and has been. Well, it was a repeating process during the Cold War, and it's been repeating ever since. So in the Cold War, like this paper says, in Chile and all these other countries, there was essentially they created a pathocracy to fight against and prevent the imposition of a pathocracy, all because they couldn't identify the actual root of the problem. They looked at communism and said, "Oh, these regimes are so bad. The problem is therefore communism. So therefore, we will do anything and everything to prevent the emergence of communism, even if that means, in practice, engaging in all of the worst types of behaviors and crimes that the communists were committing." You find the same thing in Afghanistan with the support for the Mujahideen. We have to prevent communism from, taking root in Afghanistan. And so we're going to arm these jihadis to do it. And and then it happened again in Bosnia, happened again in Syria and Libya. And it gets to the point where you've got to kind of wonder, it's like, are the people behind these supportive interventions and just support of these organizations and groups, are they really that stupid? Or, do they know what they're doing? Because it's supporting one psychopathic group to allegedly fight another psychopathic group. If they had identified the problem, diagnosed the problem, then you wouldn't have had these right-wing military dictatorships take the form that they did. You wouldn't have had the rise of global terrorism in the form of in the Islamic form, and you wouldn't have the resurgence of Nazism in Ukraine, for instance. That's another one. So in Ukraine's fight against the communists, the CIA and the West have this history of supporting, the descendants, the literal ideological descendants of, Ukrainian Nazis. So, and we can see what that's led to today. My last comment just being that this paper is, I tweeted about it several times. It's, what we've learned in this paper should go a long way to putting into context a lot of the videos that we've seen come out of Ukrainian servicemen and these, like the Azov battalion, these neo-Nazi battalions incorporated into the Ukrainian armed forces, torturing and killing prisoners of war, civilians, suspected, pro-Russian collaborators. A lot of these videos have been coming out in the last month, just showing the worst types of crimes against humanity, and the people committing them are filming it and putting it on social media. So that says something about the lack of insight, like Hare and others, in this paper talk about. So an interesting context, and of course, like the conclusion of. Well, no, I'll just leave that there. That's enough about that. Yeah, it's an important paper. It's still relevant and increasingly relevant, just like political ponerology. So I think I'll leave it there. Is there anything else? No, I think that's it. So I'll link to the sources. I'll link to this paper, ponerology, and that video, that documentary with the 40 out of the guy that scored 40 out of 40 in the show description. So check out those sources, and we'll be back soon with my co-hosts. Next time it won't be just me rambling. So thanks for tuning in, everyone. If you enjoyed the show, please like it, please subscribe, and we'll see you later. Take care.